They thought they could humiliate her in front of everyone, but they didn't expect who would walk through that door. Watch till the end to see what no one saw coming. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and write in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. The sun rose early over the red clay rooftops of Sand Ridge Academy, casting golden light over the manicured lawns and palm-lined walkways of the elite private school nestled in the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona. It was the beginning of a new week, and the students arrived in tidy uniforms of beige slacks and navy blue polos, their chatter low and drowsy. Among them walked 13-year-old Malia Kamako, her shoulders square, her steps quiet but purposeful. She didn't draw attention to herself, but those who looked closely could not ignore her intricately braided hair, adorned with small seashells woven into each braid. The shells glinted in the sun, soft and white against the deep black of her hair. It was a traditional style passed down from her grandmother, a tribute to her Polynesian heritage and an act of quiet pride that made her feel close to the islands her family came from. She had worn the braids many times before, but today something was different. As she walked through the front hall, her eyes met those of Principal Richard Grayson. He was a tall, thin man in his late 50s with steely eyes and a mouth that almost never smiled. Grayson had a reputation for strictness, a rigid interpretation of school rules, and little tolerance for anything he deemed outside the norm. When his eyes locked onto Malia's braided hair, he stopped in his tracks, and so did she. There was a moment of silence between them, sharp and cold. He stepped forward, blocking her path. "What is that on your head?" he asked, his tone sharp. Malia blinked, confused. "It's my hair, sir. I read the code. This isn't against the rules." His eyes narrowed. "Follow me," he said curtly, and turned on his heel. She followed him into the administrative wing, where he instructed her to sit and wait. Malia did as told, sitting on the hard plastic chair just outside his office. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her heart beating fast, but her face calm. Secretaries passed by without making eye contact. After what felt like an hour, Grayson emerged, not with a resolution, but with a command. She was to report to the school auditorium during third period for a disciplinary assembly. She wasn't told what for. Her stomach sank. Rumors spread quickly through the school. By the time third period arrived, the entire student body had been summoned to the auditorium. The atmosphere was tense and confused. Teachers stood along the walls like guards. Whispers buzzed like static. At exactly 10:50 a.m., Grayson took the stage. The lights dimmed, and he stood beside a small table covered with a cloth. When he spoke, his voice was amplified and severe. "We are here today," he said, "to confront what happens when students prioritize personal appearance over institutional discipline. This is not about culture or race. This is about rules." Then he called her name. "Malia Kamako, come forward." Malia sat frozen for a second-row seat. Her classmates turned to look at her. A few took out their phones. She rose slowly and walked to the stage, her chest tight, her feet heavy. Grayson lifted the cloth from the table, revealing a pair of scissors and electric clippers. Gasps rippled through the audience. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Grayson pointed to the spot in front of him. "Turn around," he ordered. She shook her head. "You can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I have every right," he snapped. "This hairstyle violates the spirit of our appearance code. It's disruptive." "No," she said more firmly now. "This is my culture. This is who I am." But he didn't stop. He stepped forward and grabbed one of her braids. "No, please," she shouted, but the scissors were already closing. Snip! The sound echoed. One braid fell, then another, and another. Students gasped. A few cried out. Malia stood still, her arms clenched at her sides, too shocked to move. The seashells clattered to the ground. Her body trembled, but she didn't let the tears fall. Then the clippers buzzed to life. A security guard stood behind her now. Grayson pressed the clippers to her scalp. Her hair dropped like feathers. The sound was cruel and mechanical. The students watched, some filming, others paralyzed. One freshman girl stood up and bolted from the auditorium. She ran straight to the office of a teacher she trusted. Another student sent the video footage to a number listed as an emergency contact on Malia's student profile. That number belonged to Chuck Norris. At 11:35 a.m., Chuck Norris was finishing a solo training session in the Arizona desert, his t-shirt soaked with sweat, his knuckles taped. His phone buzzed. He picked it up, squinted at the screen, and tapped play on the video. The moment he saw Malia, his granddaughter, her face twisted in shock, her hair falling under the hands of a school administrator, he froze. His expression didn't change. His breathing stayed calm. He tossed the phone into his duffel bag, peeled off his training gloves, and walked toward his truck. The engine rumbled to life, and the truck began heading toward Tucson. He didn't call the school. He didn't speak. He just drove. Back at the school, Malia was sent home without an apology or explanation. She sat in the passenger seat of a classmate's car, hoodie pulled tightly over her head, clutching the few braids the principal hadn't managed to cut. Her phone buzzed constantly, but she didn't answer. She felt numb, humiliated, angry, and unsure of what would come next. But someone else knew. Chuck Norris didn't need to ask questions. He had seen enough. He drove in silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on the horizon. He would arrive in Tucson by nightfall. The sky had begun to dim as Chuck Norris's pickup rolled into Tucson. He didn't waste time. He drove straight to a modest adobe-style house he kept for times he visited his granddaughter. Malia was already there, curled into a ball on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket with her hoodie pulled tightly over her shaved head. Chuck entered silently, closing the door behind him. He didn't ask questions. He didn't say a word. He walked over and sat beside her. Malia turned her head slightly, eyes puffy but dry. "I didn't think he would actually do it," she whispered. Chuck didn't respond right away. He simply reached out and gently pushed the hood back, revealing the rough patches and uneven remnants of what used to be her crown. His jaw tightened, but his hand was calm. "They thought they could break you," he said, "but all they did was show us where the cracks are." That night, Chuck made calls. Not to newspapers, not to tabloids. He called James Trent, a trusted attorney and former Marine who had fought discrimination cases before. Then he called Elena Cruz, a high school principal in Phoenix who had led a campaign to reform outdated school policies. Then he called Ryan Masters, a documentary filmmaker who owed him a favor. Within 2 hours, Chuck had a team. "No lawsuits yet," he told them, "not until they see the truth." Meanwhile, Sandridge Academy issued a generic press release calling the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding and a matter under internal review. There was no mention of Malia's name, no apology, no accountability. Principal Grayson had taken a sudden leave of absence. pending a routine investigation. But the world outside the school wasn't buying it. The video posted by students had now gone viral, shared by celebrities, educators, civil rights activists, and millions of ordinary people who were furious. Hashtags like #CrownCut, #Justice for Malia, and #Cultural Pride Matters were trending across platforms. News anchors began reporting on the incident. Parents across the country voiced their outrage. Former students of Sand Ridge anonymously came forward, sharing stories of how Grayson had punished them for wearing dreadlocks, headscarves, or beaded jewelry. A clear pattern was forming, and Chuck Norris saw it. By Tuesday morning, Chuck had reviewed every part of the school's dress and conduct code. Nowhere did it state that cultural hairstyles were banned. Nowhere did it give authority for a staff member to physically cut a student's hair. He didn't enforce a rule, Chuck told his lawyer. He enforced his discomfort. That afternoon, Chuck recorded a short video from his backyard. No makeup, no lighting crew, just a phone camera propped on the patio table. Malia sat beside him, still quiet, but no longer hiding her head. "This is my granddaughter, Malia," Chuck said. "She's strong, she's proud, and she wore her culture with dignity. What happened to her wasn't discipline, it was control, and it was wrong." The video was barely 2 minutes long, but it exploded across the internet. In 10 hours, it had been viewed 5 million times. Military veterans reposted it. Teachers praised it. Civil rights lawyers offered pro bono support. UFC fighters and action movie stars voiced solidarity. But Chuck didn't care about trending. He cared about what came next. On Wednesday morning, he returned to Sand Ridge Academy, not with cameras, not with lawyers, but with resolve. He wore dark jeans, a collared shirt, and boots that echoed across the tile floors. The school's receptionist stammered when he entered. "Principal Grayson isn't in today." "I'm not here for him," Chuck replied and walked past her. Students saw him in the hallway and fell silent. Phones lifted, recording. They didn't cheer, they didn't interrupt, they watched. When he reached the admin wing, he didn't knock. He opened the door and entered. Inside, interim principal Lauren Blackstone stood mid-meeting with 2 district officials. She looked up, surprised. "Mr. Norris, this is highly—" "So was shaving a child's head on stage," Chuck said flatly. One of the officials tried to speak, but Chuck placed a folder on the table and slid it across. 25 parents signed this, he said. A formal complaint, not just about the incident, but about the environment that allowed it. Blackstone opened the folder. Her face tightened. "We're reviewing the situation internally," she began. Chuck interrupted her. "Not good enough." Just then, the office door creaked open. Malia stood there. Her head was uncovered, her back straight. In her hand, she held one of the braids that hadn't been cut. She walked silently over to the table and placed the braid down next to the complaint file. No one said a word. She didn't need to. Chuck looked at the officials. "You tried to cut her down," he said. "Now you're going to watch her rise." Outside the office, dozens of students stood watching. Teachers paused. Something had shifted in the school. A silence had broken, and the walls that once echoed with indifference now pulsed with tension. The fight was no longer theoretical. It had a face, a name, a voice, and that voice was no longer silent. By that evening, the school board was flooded with calls and emails. More parents came forward. Former teachers submitted statements. A movement had begun. Chuck returned home, poured a black coffee, and sat beside Malia on the porch. She looked at him and asked, "Do we have to keep going?" He nodded. "Until they can't do this to anyone else." By Thursday morning, the tension around Sand Ridge Academy was impossible to ignore. Students walked the halls with uncertain eyes, teachers whispered in staff rooms, and the front office received an endless stream of calls from media outlets and angry parents. Despite the district's attempt to frame the incident as an internal matter under review, the damage was already done. The footage of Malia having her hair cut on stage had traveled far beyond Arizona. In New York, an editorial titled "The Scissors That Shamed a Nation" ran on the front page of a major newspaper. In Los Angeles, educators protested in solidarity. In Honolulu, community leaders cited Malia's case as a call to action to defend Indigenous identity in American schools. At the center of it all, Malia Kamako returned to school. She entered the gates of Sand Ridge not hidden by her hoodie, but with her bare scalp visible to the world. Her steps were steady, her silence louder than ever before. The students noticed. Some nodded to her as she passed. Others lowered their eyes, unsure of how to approach someone who had become a symbol. Chuck Norris stayed behind the scenes, but his presence was felt. He met quietly with families who had similar experiences. He helped coordinate statements from parents, drafted proposals with legal teams, and worked with educators who wanted change. But the school administration was not ready to give up control. On Friday morning, word leaked that the district was considering a candidate to serve as interim principal while the investigation into Richard Grayson continued. The name on the short list, Michael Grayson, Richard's younger brother. Officially, Michael had no record of misconduct. He had served as a school administrator in Florida for years, with a spotless public file. But Chuck knew better than to trust appearances. He requested a full background check. Within 24 hours, it arrived on his desk. Buried in the sealed Human Resources section of Michael's employment file was a complaint filed 5 years earlier by the parents of a black student who had been suspended for gang-related appearance. The boy had worn dreadlocks and a kente cloth bracelet. The school settled quietly. No formal admission of wrongdoing, no press, just a few signatures in a sealed envelope. Chuck looked at the papers and clenched his jaw. The pattern was clear. That Monday, Chuck and his attorney, James Trent, arrived unannounced at the office of Superintendent Rachel Monroe, the woman overseeing all district decisions. She received them reluctantly. Chuck placed the report on her desk. "You told the country you wanted change," he said. "Appointing the brother of the man who humiliated my granddaughter isn't change, it's camouflage." Monroe read the file. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached the last page. "I didn't know," she said. "Now you do," Chuck replied. "So do what's right, before someone else does it for you." By the end of the day, the announcement was made. The district would reconsider its options for interim leadership. But it was too late. Students were already organizing. Malia had been invited to speak at a student-led assembly scheduled for Friday morning, 1 week to the day since the original incident. At first, she declined. The thought of returning to that stage, where she had been violated in front of her peers, made her stomach turn. But Chuck said something that stayed with her. "They took something from you on that stage. Now you have the chance to take something back." That Friday, the auditorium filled again. But this time, there were no clippers, no scissors, no principal on stage, only a microphone. Malia stood behind the curtain, her speech folded in her hand. But when the curtains opened, she didn't read. She looked out at her classmates, her voice calm and steady. "A week ago, I was called to this stage and told my identity didn't belong here," she said. "I was told my hair, my culture, my story was a distraction. I was humiliated. But I'm still here. And I'm not alone." The room was quiet, not because no one cared, but because they did. You might think this is just about me, but it's not. It's about every student who's ever been told to cut, hide, or erase a part of themselves to fit in. It's about the rules that punish expression instead of understanding it. And it's about making sure no one ever has to stand where I stood, unless it's by choice. When she stepped back, the silence was broken not by clapping, but by the sound of feet standing up across the auditorium. One row after another, students rose to their feet. Some clapped, some cried, some simply stood, shoulders squared, eyes locked forward. That moment, captured on dozens of phones, went viral within hours. The footage made its way to television networks, education panels, and the inboxes of state representatives. By the end of the weekend, a draft was circulating in the Arizona State Legislature, a proposed bill to protect cultural and religious expression in schools. The draft was informally referred to as the Malia Bill. Chuck didn't push it. He didn't have to. The movement had taken on a life of its own. But just as momentum began to build, a new threat arrived. On Tuesday morning, Chuck received a certified letter at his home. Inside was a lawsuit, filed by none other than Richard Grayson. The former principal was suing Chuck, Malia, and the newly formed educational advocacy network they had helped launch, alleging defamation and emotional distress. The claim argued that Chuck had used his celebrity status to destroy a man's career, and that Malia had exaggerated the incident for media attention. Chuck read the papers in silence. Then he picked up his phone and called James Trent. "He wants to start something," he said. "Then let's show him what it feels like when it's finished." They didn't go public. Not yet. They arranged a closed-door mediation meeting, a private room in Phoenix. No press, no cameras, just Chuck, his attorney, and Richard Grayson. When Grayson entered the room, he looked different, thinner, older, bitter. "You turned me into a villain," he said. "You humiliated me." "You did that to yourself," Chuck replied. "You think you're a hero? I don't need to be a hero," Chuck said. "I just need to be a witness." Then he pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were sworn statements from teachers, students, and parents, hidden policies, internal emails, sealed settlements, proof of a pattern. Chuck leaned forward. "You take this to court, and this becomes public record. Every page, every name, every victim. You want that?" Grayson looked at the papers. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came. The lawsuit was dropped the next day. Chuck didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He drove back to Tucson, back to his granddaughter, and handed her the signed dismissal form. "It's done," he said. But both of them knew the truth. It wasn't done. Not yet. The desert air was calm the following week, but the atmosphere at Sand Ridge Academy was anything but. The administration was quiet, subdued under the weight of national attention and local pressure. The walls that once echoed with polished silence and order now bore murals, artwork created by students that celebrated identity, heritage, and pride. Where once rules had been written to suppress difference, now voices were speaking louder than policies. Malia walked the school's halls not as a symbol of pity, but of power. Her shaved head was no longer a mark of shame. It had become a badge of resilience. Students who had once hidden their cultural hairstyles began to wear them openly. A Navajo boy returned with his hair in a traditional braid. A Somali girl who had stopped wearing her headscarf after repeated warnings from teachers now wore it again, standing taller than before. A change had begun, not in policy yet, but in people. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris remained quietly active behind the scenes. Together with a small team of educators, lawyers, and parents, he worked to develop a nonprofit focused on school reform. The organization was named SHIELD, Students Honored in Expression, Legacy, and Dignity. Its mission was clear: to expose discriminatory practices in schools, provide legal assistance to families, and push for legislative change at the state and federal levels. What had started with one girl's braids had evolved into a nationwide movement. Word came from the Arizona State Capitol that the proposed Malia bill had passed its first committee. The legislation, officially titled the Student Cultural Expression Protection Act, outlined strict limits on disciplinary actions related to hair, clothing, and other non-disruptive cultural expressions. The bill also proposed mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all school staff across the state. News anchors called it one of the most significant education reforms in a decade. Malia and Chuck were invited to attend the public hearing in Phoenix, where the bill would be debated. Malia was nervous but determined. Before they left, Chuck sat with her on the back porch of their house and said, "This time, when you speak, it won't just be your school listening. It'll be the whole state." At the Capitol, the hearing chamber was full. Educators, parents, students, lawmakers, and journalists crowded into the room. Malia stepped up to the microphone. She didn't carry a script. She didn't need one. "When I came to school that morning," she began, "I wore my grandmother's story on my head. Each braid was a piece of my history, and someone thought they could erase it with a pair of scissors. But what they didn't understand is identity doesn't live in hair. It lives in the soul. And when you try to shame it, it only grows stronger." The room was silent. Not because it didn't care, but because it did. Several lawmakers nodded. One wiped her eye. Malia continued, "This isn't just about me. It's about every student who's been told they need to look a certain way to be accepted. It's about telling every child that who they are is enough, that their culture is not a disruption, it's a contribution." She stepped back. The room erupted in applause, not out of formality, but out of truth. By the end of the week, the bill passed through the full House of Representatives with overwhelming support. The governor issued a statement calling it a critical correction to an outdated system. Back at Sand Ridge, changes were no longer just symbolic. The school board appointed a new principal, Cynthia James, a seasoned educator and reformist with a background in restorative justice. Her first act as leader was to abolish the current grooming policy entirely. In its place, she implemented a respect and representation code, created in partnership with students and parents. Her second act was to invite Malia to help form a Student Voice Council, a group that would meet monthly to review concerns and give feedback directly to school leadership. On the last Friday of the school year, the school held a community event in the auditorium. Malia was invited to speak once more. But this time, she wasn't alone. She stood beside students from across the district, Black, Native, Asian, Latino, white, each of them wearing their cultural attire, hairstyles, and accessories with pride. Behind them, a mural hung from the stage's back wall, a girl with a shaved head standing tall beneath the words, Our roots are not a violation. Malia stepped up to the mic. This isn't a story about hair, she said. It's a story about what happens when someone tries to silence you and you refuse to stay quiet. This is about all of us, and this is only the beginning. That evening, Chuck stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed, a rare smile breaking across his weathered face. When the event ended, he and Malia walked home in silence under the desert sky. As they sat on the porch, Malia looked up and asked, "Do you think it'll happen again somewhere else?" Chuck nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "but next time there'll be more people ready to stand up. Because of what you did." She leaned against him. "We didn't plan this." "No," he replied, "but we finished it." And though the stars above them said nothing, their quiet light was enough to know the fight had meant something. Not just for one girl, but for every kid who'd ever been told to be less. Now, thanks to Malia, and to the man who had stood behind her, the world had learned what it meant to be more. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one.